Good afternoon, Your Highnesses, Excellencies, dignitaries, members of the ABLF network, and all of our wonderful audience members. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Resham Katecha. I'm a policy and strategy specialist based here in the UK, and I am delighted to be here at the ABLF City, and especially delighted to be hosting this final session with an incredible man. Dr Aaditya Mattoo is Chief Economist of the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. He specializes in development, trade, international cooperation, and provides policy advice to governments. Before joining the World Bank, he was an economic counselor at the World Trade Organization, and he taught economics at the University of Sussex and Churchill College, Cambridge. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge and an MPhil in economics from the University of Oxford. If you weren't impressed enough already, I can tell you that his work has also been cited in The Economist, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and Time magazine. So Aditya, thank you so much for being here with us today. I cannot wait to hear about your insights into the global economy and what we can expect in times to come. I wanted to ask you, drawing on your report, the World Bank's East Asia Economic Fall 2020 update from containment to recovery, and from your other recent work, could you tell us how the COVID-19 shock is affecting East Asia?
Thank you very much, Resham, and to your colleagues for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here and to be interviewed by somebody who has had such a dynamic future and an even more dynamic, I should say, dynamic past and an even more dynamic future. And I work primarily on East Asia. So the focus of my presentation will be on that region, but I'm happy to speak about issues of global significance. The shock that we have seen has been devastating for the whole world. I think it is something that is common knowledge. In East Asia, you have to go back to the Asian financial crisis to see a comparable contraction in countries in the region. But in China's case, you'd have to go even further back. You'd have to go back to 1976, when Chairman Mao's death and the Tangshan earthquake shook the country. That's when you saw such a comparable contraction. And the reason is that we have witnessed a triple shock. The region has suffered, first of all, the shock of the disease itself, then of all the measures that have had to be taken, the shutdowns in a bid to contain the disease, and finally, the reverberations from the rest of the world as the world has slipped into a deep global recession. To some extent, the impact has been mitigated by the actions of governments to support their households, to firms, and to beef up the health system. But overall, we are seeing the slowest growth in the region, less than 1% in the year 2020. It's slower, as I said, than we've seen in decades. But it has affected different countries in the region differently. And it has depended, first of all, on how efficiently they have succeeded in containing the disease. Some countries like China, Vietnam, through a combination of early decisive action combined with very effective recourse to testing, tracing, and isolation, combined with effective information campaigns, which have led to a durable change in behavior. This is a contrast, Resham, with what happened in Europe, because people relaxed as soon as the first wave was contained. I think the remarkable achievement in these countries is that there has been a durably precautionary behavior. So in China and Vietnam, you've had great success, but then there are countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, and now more recently Myanmar and Malaysia, which are still struggling to contain the disease. So that's the first big difference across. It's as in the world, even within the region, you have differences in the efficiency of containment. The second big difference is how they're exposed to the world. Now, again, countries like Vietnam, China, Malaysia, these are countries which produced manufactured goods, and notably electronic goods. And interestingly, unlike in most previous crises, demand for these consumer durables has been quite durable. It hasn't shrunk. People are buying televisions and computers and kitchen equipment, and all these things, demand has remained resilient and so has trade. And that means that these countries, which are very competitive producers of manufactured goods like China, Vietnam, Malaysia, haven't suffered so much as a consequence of the global recession. But on the other hand, countries like the Philippines and Thailand and the Pacific Islands, which are much more dependent on tourism and services, they have seen a very sharp contraction. So that's the second big difference, how you're exposed to the world. The third difference is how effectively the government has tried to shore up the economy in the face of these shocks. And there, I think what has been striking is that some countries were had a stronger fiscal position. And the region as a whole has tried to scale up support by as much as 5% of GDP, helping firms, helping households, strengthening the health sector. And overall, I think when you look at the world, I think East Asia has done much better. But there are these countries, especially Indonesia and the Philippines, which have seen quite a substantial contraction.
Incredibly interesting, thank you. And there's so much I want to pick up from that section, but just moving forward on your slides, in addition to the economic pain today, do we need to worry about the impact of the shock on growth and inequality in the longer term? Is that something we all have to be concerned about?
I think you're absolutely right to point to these longer term consequences, because if you see today the region, I think its future is going to depend much more on how governments act than on the virus. And because there is a real risk that there will be a durable scars which are going to affect long-term growth. First of all, there is the problem that governments are going to go forward with much higher debt than they had. Mm-hmm. That risks crowding out public investment in roads, ports, schools, and that could hurt growth in the long term. At the same time, there is a problem that the private sector is going to emerge from this crisis with much more debt. Mm-hmm. Banks are going to have much worse balance sheets. So you can think of this as a twin balance sheet problem. Plus, there is an environment of global uncertainty. Now, what the result of these balance sheet problems and persistent uncertainty is that it inhibits investment. So private investment is going to be lower, and both domestic and foreign. So even though short-term capital had made a dramatic exit from the region and then quietly crept back, it's this longer-term investment on which growth really depends that remains and is likely to remain depressed because of both, as I said, debt and uncertainty, the private sector debt and the banks themselves struggling. The third problem, and perhaps the worst in terms of the inequality consequences of this whole shock, is what the shock is going to do to human capital. Now, whether it's sickness, food insecurity, school closures, or job loss, that's going to erode the human skills and abilities in a way that unfortunately might have long-lasting effects. Work that's been done at the World Bank shows that school closures in the region are likely to reduce human capital in terms of a measure which is learning adjusted years of schooling. 1 year of learning adjusted schooling will be lost. And the people who are at a school going age today might lose as much as 4% of their incomes for the rest of their life.
Wow.
So that is, the third big shock, which is, so think of it, we economists think of production functions. We think of capital, and that's being hurt by investment. We think of labor, and that's being eroded because of what's going to happen to human capital. And finally is the loss in productivity. You see, when a firm operates, it acquires a lot of intangible capital, skills, managerial knowledge, good matches between firms and managers. Once it shuts down, all that is lost. That loss is compounded by the disruption in trade and global value chains, these relationships between firms and their suppliers and firms and their consumers. That's also really valuable. And if those are disrupted and broken up, then you have a big loss in productivity, because you're not going to immediately come back and start these firms again, because something that was valuable is irrevocably lost because of this. And that can have an effect. And finally, even research and development is being disrupted. Labs are shut, and all that compounded leads to our prediction that the region, if it doesn't take strong remedial action, could see lower growth as much as 1 percentage point every year for the next decade.
Wow, what an incredible impact on the region's economies that would be. So what do governments need to do to come out of recession and to deal with these extensive challenges that you've outlined for us in East Asia particularly?
So the governments in the region have already demonstrated in many cases remarkable capacity to contain the disease, but the battle isn't over. So this need to contain the disease remains a priority, not just, as I said, in Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar or Malaysia, but also in Vietnam and China, which were on top of it, but have seen occasional resurgence. Now that means, of course, quickly deploying the vaccine efficiently and fairly. That's important not just for economic revival, it's important for social stability. But at the same time, it also means maintaining the other measures like testing, tracing, and isolation. You see, this is a big risk. The world might think that now the vaccine offers salvation, but there is research which shows that even the effectiveness of a vaccine depends on maintaining these other non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks, social distancing, and especially testing and tracing. So that has to be a priority in all our countries, the whole world. I come from India. I think the idea that just because a vaccine has come, you can abandon the other ways of limiting the spread of the disease would be a mistake. And here again, some countries in the region, Vietnam had a test to infection ratio of 800, which shows how effectively you're covering the population. Indonesia for a long time had a ratio of 8, which means that they weren't really being able to scale up. And here I think the whole world made mistakes. We invested a lot of money in ventilators and not enough on PCR assay machines, so to prevent the spread of the disease. So I think even the deployment of the vaccines, we need to think hard. That battle isn't over. That's number one. Number two is, I told you that the big risk is the government is obliged to and rightly spending a lot of money in helping households survive and smooth their consumption. It's helping firms to not go bankrupt, because as I said, that leads to a durable loss in intangible assets. But the governments in this region have historically been stingy. They spent less than 1% of their GDP on social protection. And the reason was they really didn't raise much revenue in the first place. They raised on average just 1/5 of GDP as revenue. Even other emerging markets, the share is closer to 1/4. In industrial countries, it's 1/3. So the capacity of the state in this region to help out, to stabilize, to invest even as it helps is quite limited. So I think looking ahead, the government has to find a way that they can mobilize more revenue and also stop wasteful expenditure. Most of all on energy subsidies. These are not green. They are wasteful, they're regressive, they accrue mostly to the rich. And some countries in the region spend as much as 2% of their incomes on energy subsidies. So that's priority 2, fiscal reform, both in terms of mobilizing revenue and not wasting money. I spoke to you already about social protection. I think it'll remain important. The world is not suddenly going to bounce back. This crisis the disease was unequal in its effect. It hurt the poor more. The way the shutdowns were operated hurt the poor more. The rich had, digital connections, savings, and access to schools. The poor didn't. and that has hurt them more. So social protection is also vital. And again, as I said, the region was stingy. It needs to rethink its whole approach to social protection. They've gambled on growth always, that firms will grow and lift everybody out of poverty. Now that has worked, but I think that's changing and they need to rethink that. They need to continue to help their firms, but in a way that doesn't inhibit the reallocation of workers, of capital, to where it will be most productive in future. Because the world is changing. You can't have zombie firms and you support them and they hold on to resources, and that could kill growth because you need some firms to exit. So that's hard. How do you decide whom to help and whom to let go? When you don't have a lot of information, you can't look ahead. That's a crucial thing. Smart schooling is vital. You need to think of clever ways. You can't just hope that digital connectivity and learning is going to reach everybody. You need to develop safety protocols so that the poor especially can get back to school. And finally, it's vital that this region, which has been so open to goods trade and investment and has benefited enormously from it, must stop being suspicious of services reform. They continue to protect transport, telecom, finance, and that's probably true in a lot of other parts of the world. And this crisis has shown, for example, that you have tremendous need for efficient services, both in order to make your firms productive and to equip your households to participate in this new digital economy. They need to be better connected, they need to have better access to finance, and they need better skills. That's why you need better health and education. And that, I would say, is perhaps the final and the most important reform this region needs. It's done remarkably well in goods. It's lagging behind in services at a time where services will matter more than ever.
And I want to pick up on your comments about trade and protectionism. How has the COVID-19 shock affected trade and global value chains, which have in the past played a really central role in East Asia's remarkable growth?
That's a nice question, because you're right that this region has really benefited more than almost any other region from growth. Now, this crisis is interestingly different, for example, from the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, GDP contracted by a certain amount, but trade plummeted. Today, we saw quite the opposite. This time, GDP, incomes plummeted, and trade didn't contract quite so much, and more interestingly, is recovering relatively quickly. You know, people say, oh, the global value chains are going to shift, and there is a good economic reason to do that. And because, you know, perhaps it is true that firms were chasing efficiency and looking for the lowest cost locations, and now they need to pay more attention to resilience to make sure that things are not disrupted. But if you look at what really happened, say you had a firm which was producing in China, what would you learn? What would you say? It's not obvious the conclusion is to abandon China. True, there was disruption, but sure enough, there was also recovery, and you know, the economy got back to work with almost as much alacrity as it shut down. So if you were to go away from China, where would you go? Where would you get that scale and connectivity? And I think that's what we are seeing. People talk about and everywhere about relocation of global value chains, and it's evident in all conversations, but not at all in the trade data. But nevertheless, I do think that there is pressure to reduce excessive reliance on single locations. And there must be some switching. And this is what we saw, for example, when the tsunami hit Japan. You didn't see reshoring and people bringing production back home. You saw some switching. And I think that's what we are going to see now, and we are seeing now, and perhaps with some inducements like from governments like the British government or the Japanese government, who are worried that maybe the private sector places too much emphasis on efficiency and not enough on resilience. So if everybody chooses to be in one location, it's not good for everybody. So I do think we'll have some switching, but then the question is, where will people go? And some work we've done suggests that firms are moving to countries like Vietnam, but not to countries like Indonesia. And that raises the question of what's the difference? And the difference is countries' own policies matter a lot. Vietnam has succeeded in lowering its protection, improving its logistics, strengthening its trade institutions in a way that many other countries have not. So I think that is, so the first is this rapid recovery. Second is relocation. We do also see regionalization. You know, one interesting thing is that this region has recovered faster than other parts of the world, so it's trading more with each other. There is one slightly worrying aspect, which is that we are likely to see protection. But let me come back to that before I mention a fourth dimension, which is the growth in services. See, one other aspect of this, people are worrying about what's happening to globalization. They miss the fact that the crisis, by encouraging people like you and me to become more digital, to become, invest in digital connectivity, both in terms of our equipment and our skills, is also encouraging firms to do the same. But once you do that, Resham, you're not tied to your local producer of services. Think of health. When you would rather see your doctor face to face, but once you see that, look, I can do a lot digitally, then why should you do it just with the local doctor? You can do it with anybody in the world. And that means that tourism has collapsed, but digital trade in services is growing. And that, I think, is going to be a durable change, because once you learn these skills and once you buy this equipment, it's not a reversible process. This is a durable change. And so I think we are going to see a rapid globalization in services, which creates remarkable new opportunities. And that's another reason for the region and the world in general to abandon protection and embrace this new digital world by improving connectivity for the people. But finally, you said protection, and I think it's a very good point. I don't think we have seen as much. We saw this perverse nationalism where countries tried to hold on to medical equipment and might now try to hold on to vaccines for their own people. And we know that would be counterproductive, and that we saw, but we didn't see so much other protection, fortunately, yet. But there is a risk that as recovery happens and people are suspicious of foreign firms being able to sell more and sell more cheaply thanks to their government subsidies, we might see anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. So there is a risk that this asynchronized recovery might generate more protectionist pressure in future.
Of course, and we know that trade creation and diversion brings some costs and some benefits. So it depends who the winners are and who the losers are. And of course, that brings inherent policy tension. So given the trade and international policy tensions we've witnessed in the last few years, how do you see international cooperation evolving, and what can be done to prevent that retreat from globalization that has brought so much improvement to the way we live our lives over the past few decades?
I think that is probably going to be one of the central questions of our time and crucial for recovery. I think there are two big reasons why we saw a retreat from globalization, particularly in the United States, but also in your country, Resham, in the United Kingdom and in other parts of the world. One is this problem that globalization itself facilitated convergence or catch-up, and it facilitated the growth of China. And I think that has meant that we are witnessing a period where there is going to be what we can refer to as a hegemonic transition. In the 19th century, Resham, it was Britain who was the global hegemon. And people, when they hear about the horrors of the Opium War, forget some remarkable things that, that was a period when Britain, when it induced China to open its ports, didn't do that for its own benefit. They didn't say, okay, it's just for us. They said this is for the whole world. And that was the area of, or period of Pax Britannica, or free trade imperialism. And Britain played that central pillar role for a long time till it became insecure when Germany and United States caught up. And finally, after the Great Depression, that's when they went back to imperial preferences and wanted protection. I think something similar we are seeing in the case of the United States, which after the Second World War took over the British mantle, ushered in the general agreement on tariffs and trade, and became the pillar of a multilateral system of allowing everybody to trade freely. It began to feel less sure when the Japanese industrialization led to the Japanese catch-up, but they survived that. I think their big wobble has come when China has caught up. So I think there is a deeper problem in the world, that the structural change has maybe created a kind of deep insecurity and maybe a concern about hegemonic transition. And that's not going to disappear with a change in the US administration. What might hopefully change is that from unilateral, more confrontation, we might see a more cooperative approach to the legitimate concerns that China's own policies raise in other countries. The other big problem, of course, is inequality. The world has become more equal thanks to developing countries catch up, but within countries, there is greater inequality because the pressure from developing countries has kept wages down in places like the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe. Now, I believe that if we are going to keep trade open, we need to think of cooperation beyond trade. We need to think of ways in which governments can cooperate, for example, in the area of taxation, because that's a big problem. You see, openness to trade, Resham, you've done economics, you'll see, was based on the idea that the cake expands. The country as a whole is better off, but it's distributed unequally. But because the cake is bigger, you can compensate the losers. Now, the problem is the winners have become internationally mobile. Capital can run away to another jurisdiction, as can skilled people. So they're very hard to tax. So taxing the winners is hard, so compensating the losers is hard. So the workers are suffering what I think is referred to in America as a double whammy. They're losing from globalization and they're bearing the burden of taxation. And that you can't fix on your own, because it's like a race to the bottom across countries. And the only way to deal with that is to cooperate. We also need to cooperate on regulation. Data flows are going to be more and more important. China needs to reassure the rest of the world that it's going to make sure that the state and security apparatus doesn't interfere with its big giants. Otherwise, it's going to inhibit their growth. They will have to continue to operate just in China. I think that kind of regulatory cooperation is going to be really important. And finally, we need to expand the scope of cooperation to encompass these new measures, Chinese state enterprises, government subsidies, all the things that are going to unleash new protectionist pressures. We need to find ways of cooperating beyond trade if we are going to keep trade open. And that we all have a stake in, because we're all better off when trade and people and ideas and investment can flow freely across the world.
Absolutely. Let's all ensure the cake still gets bigger and we all get some of the icing. So how is the World Bank addressing those structural inequalities?
I think that is a challenge for our institution. I think we need to navigate, as I said, this hegemonic transition as well, because, but primarily by first of all extending assistance to developing countries to help them build the capacity to engage productively in the global economy, whether it is by building the hard infrastructure of ports, roads, or digital connectivity, or the soft infrastructure of schools, healthcare, so that they can equip their people to engage productively. But at the same time, I think the World Bank has been a powerful advocate for international cooperation, for openness, not a mechanical liberalization, but for openness conditioned on good, sound regulation. For example, in financial services, we recognize that just mechanical opening up can lead to financial instability. But I think the world and the World Bank need to decide, how do you design regulation in a world where technology is changing rapidly? My conclusion from the first part was all these negative things that COVID will do to long-term growth, but it's also going to do one very powerful positive thing. It's unleashing a rapid growth in new technologies and their adoption across the world. That, I think, how do you manage it in a way? You design regulation in a way that it doesn't inhibit that growth, but encourages it and makes sure that technology doesn't create unequal growth, but more equal growth. That's, I think, a challenge both for my institution and all of us.
And I think I can speak on behalf of the audience, Aditya, when I say I wish we could keep you here for longer, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for the instrumental work you're doing at the World Bank and for sharing your insights and thoughts with us. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you missed the start of this session or any other sessions today, you can go back and watch them in the ABLF City, and please make sure you join us for the closing notes. So Aditya, thank you once again. That was absolutely fascinating. And thank you for joining us. To the audience, remember we are back every month featuring global leaders in powerful conversations.
Thank you very much, Resham, and thank you very much to ABLF for inviting me. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.